Romana, life in the Roman Empire. The Augustan settlement proved to be a workable solution to the problem of imperial rule in the Mediterranean. Utilizing a minimal central bureaucracy and relying at the local level on leadership and city councils, Augustus was able to enact legislation and to maintain order for a wide and diverse population. He channeled the aggressive energy of the Roman oligarchy to useful pursuits. He ended the abuse of corrupt governors and kept the armies under control. He reduced the tax burden on the Roman provincials. The one problem he failed to resolve was the suitable means of succession. This led inevitably to inevitable jockeying for position within the imperial family, his extended blended family, known as the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which reigned from 27 to 68 AD, 27 BC to 68 AD. The remarkable thing about the developments of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, some crazy emperors, let's make it clear, is that Augustus' solution of power sharing, this relationship between the princeps, first citizen, himself, the Senate, and the military commanders on the frontiers, survived both madman, Caligula, at the helm, and internal civil war, the War of the Four Emperors, the Year of the Four Emperors, 68-69 AD, to furnish a lasting model for organizing the resources and human manpower of the Mediterranean world. The Augustan settlement proved successful in a number of other ways. It stabilized the military situation and brought accountability and order to the provinces. Increasingly, the Roman legions became based along the borders, and they used this natural boundaries of the Danube and the Rhine rivers and man-made defenses. These are known as the limes, to keep the Germans at bay, fortresses in the desert to keep people out here, and the same thing out here. We can still see the road system out here by satellite, for example, of the Roman roads between the camps. He reduced the tax burden on Roman provincials. Hold on, where are we here? The army was put to the borders, far removed from the urban populations, in order to confront neighboring barbarian people such as the Germanic tribes to the north of the Danube. Eventually, the legions became settled into permanent army camps along the limes, a line of natural and man-made barriers that defined the boundaries of the Roman Empire. He likewise curbed the abuses of Roman provincial governors and the Roman tax collectors in pacified provinces. This meant that the provincials were able to keep more of their earnings for themselves. One theory holds that despite the imposition of the Roman tithe, approximately 10%, productivity in the Roman Mediterranean actually expanded at this time. With peace and stability guaranteed, people began to invest more extensively in artisanal and agricultural production, such as wine and oil for export purposes. The hypothesized result of so much economic activity was a rising curve in material production throughout the Mediterranean at this time. Basically, agriculture, there's very few areas of this world that wasn't exploited, wasn't opened up, cleared, and converted to agricultural production. Some scholars argue that productivity attained its peak during the 2nd century AD, and that it stood at a level unmatched anywhere in the globe until the rise of modern nation-states in the early modern era, around 1600 AD. The order achieved by the Augustan settlement brought the greatest period of peace and prosperity to the broadest possible population base found anywhere in ancient times. Some 50 to 100 million people existed under the Pax Romana. Cities such as Rome and Alexandria burgeoned to more than 1 million. Women in the Roman world enjoyed greater autonomy. Again, we hear from the complaints of men, male poets, satirists, that women were actively publicly active as lawyers, doctors, philosophers, rhetoricians, and teachers, and gladiators. Maybe when you take the army and put it away and you don't have the role of the military as being the dominant of society, it levels the playing field and women have more opportunity. We really see in particular Roman aristocratic women in the provinces kind of stepping up and assuming the role of men, running their towns as priestesses, for example. And that's Placia Magna Pergae, the example I always use, because she wasn't eligible for office. So they had to kind of create offices that women sort of filled the vacuum as men began to think, well, what's the point of me being a big cheese in town if I don't get to run the show? You know, the Roman bureaucracy is in charge, so why should I spend my money? But women stepped forward because they kind of felt like, I have to live in this town, and it needs a water system, it needs a proper hospital, it needs this, it needs that. And so we see women becoming proactive and engaged in ways unprecedented, really, anywhere east of India or China for certain. Roman rule enabled the assimilation of common or mainstream cultural values that were assembled from various constituent populations of the Mediterranean. We talk about the Greco-Roman culture, Greco-Roman world, the sort of mainstream culture that all the great cities sort of imbued, and how it was homogeneous. You could sail from Antioch in Syria to Saguntum in Spain and expect to see the same kind of monumental layout. There will be a council house. There will be a Roman law court, a basilica. There will be temples. There'll be a marketplace. It's sort of, very, very homogeneous throughout this culture. Slavery remained a crucial component of society. Increasingly, peace and stability caused Roman society to evolve into a two-class society. I mean, if you have law and order, then stable populations mean that property is handed down and not expropriated, and it evolves into kind of rich and poor. We hear about this two-class society, these wealthy and socially superior honestiores enjoying greater rights and privileges than the masses of humiliores. And it includes things like being subjected to torture in a tribunal, for example, and it does have an impact later. The prosperity of the imperial order remained relatively superficial in that any major calamity, such as a massive earthquake or a civil war, could convert imperial surplus into deficits. Military and economic crises beset the Roman Mediterranean after 180 AD, when we had this massive plague, which may have wiped out a quarter of the population of the Mediterranean, and forced the hierarchy to adapt a top-down military command. During the 50-year intervals between 235 and 284 AD, known as the era of the Barracks emperors, there were 24 emperors. By the time of Diocletian, 284 to 305, the face of the imperial bureaucracy had assumed a decidedly military complexion, sort of warlords. Imperial authority amounted to a dictatorship with a bureaucracy geared toward administering a perpetual military emergency. Despite this chaos, the evidence suggests that the population levels remained relatively large, particularly in the eastern provinces, and that military government made an essential effort to maintain the resources and stability of the empire. Based on material remains, in other words, some archaeologists have argued that the decline in Rome was sort of a slow burn. The Emperor Constantine, 312 to 336 AD, is mainly known for his promotion and guidance of Christianity, which until then was a banned religious cult that endured repeated waves of persecution. Constantine allowed Christians to practice their faith publicly, and the church itself to acquire property. Christian clergy became exempt from taxation. At the urging of bishops, he even convened several church councils, such as the Council of Nicaea, where we get our Nicene Creed, 327 AD, to establish Christian dogma and church hierarchy. Although Christians represented a relatively low 10% of the Mediterranean population at this time, the popularity of Christianity spread to important places in the military hierarchy. The four traditional reasons used to explain the collapse of the Roman Empire were the inadequate means of imperial succession. So when a dynasty died out, there would be a civil war for succession. The growing number of wars promoted by these generals who because the armies became isolated, saw themselves as separate from the empire. Mounting barbarian pressures on the frontiers, the Germans from the north, the Parthians from the east, and the Sassanid Persians. And the cost of maintaining a very large military establishment, which proved just too costly for what was essentially a subsistence agricultural society. Regardless of the sequence of events, the fact remains that the Roman Empire, like the Han Dynasty in China and the Guptas in India, proved unsustainable. All three civilizations hit a major snag at the end of 2nd century AD. And although there's a slow burn, they all collapsed by the 6th century AD.